I almost drove past her, and I would have never known she was the only person who could change everything. The rain came down in thin, steady lines, turning the quiet Manhattan street into a blur of reflections, streetlights stretching like gold across wet asphalt, neon signs trembling in puddles, the city humming low and distant like it was holding its breath. Ethan Cole gripped the steering wheel of his black Bentley, eyes forward, jaw tight, the soft purr of the engine the only thing grounding him in the moment. He had just left another dinner, another perfectly curated woman, another flawless smile, another conversation that felt like a transaction dressed up as connection. He had turned her down like he always did. He always did. Because he knew how it ended. It always ended the same. His phone buzzed once on the console, lighting up with a name he ignored, the glow fading as quickly as his interest. Outside, the rain thickened, tapping gently against the windshield in a rhythm that felt almost too calm for a city that never really slept. He should have kept driving. He almost did. Then he saw her. She stepped off the curb like she wasn't sure the ground would hold her, a small figure under the streetlight, her thin jacket soaked through, clinging to her arms. Her hair hung damp against her face, and even from 20 feet away, Ethan could see the way her shoulders trembled, not from the cold alone, but from something deeper, something heavier. She was walking fast, but not toward anything. Just away. Away from something she didn't want to turn back to. His foot hovered over the gas. Keep driving. That was the rule. Don't get involved. Don't complicate things. But something about the way she wiped her face with the back of her hand, quick, almost like she was embarrassed even though no one was watching, made his grip tighten. She stumbled. Not enough to fall, but enough to break the rhythm of her escape. And for a second, she just stood there in the rain, shoulders rising and falling, like she was trying to breathe through something that wouldn't let go. Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing. This wasn't his problem. It never was. That's what had kept his life simple, controlled, predictable. Women came and went. Conversation started and ended. Nothing stayed long enough to matter. Nothing ever got close enough to hurt him again. But his hand didn't move. The car slowed. The engine's hum softened as his foot eased off the pedal. The city seemed quieter now, the rain louder, the distance between them shrinking with every second he didn't drive away. She started walking again, faster this time, like she could outrun whatever was breaking inside her. Ethan's jaw flexed. He could leave right now. In 10 seconds, she'd be gone in his rearview mirror, just another stranger swallowed by the night. He'd forget her by morning. He always forgot. But instead, his turn signal clicked softly in the silence, the car drifting toward the curb. He didn't even realize he had made the decision until the Bentley rolled to a stop beside her, tires whispering against the wet pavement. For a moment, he just sat there, watching through the rain-streaked glass. This was the part where he changed his mind. Where he drove off. Where he stayed exactly who he had always been. His hand moved to the door handle. And paused. Then, slowly, he pushed it open, the cold night air rushing in as the rain touched his skin. "Hey," he called out, his voice steady but unfamiliar even to himself. The girl froze mid-step, turning slightly, her eyes wide, guarded, unsure whether to trust or run. And in that single moment, standing between leaving and staying, Ethan Cole, who had turned down every woman without a second thought, realized this was the first time in years he didn't want to walk away. She did not run, but she did not move closer either, standing there in the rain like a question she was not ready to answer, her fingers curling slightly into the sleeves of her soaked jacket as she studied him with quiet caution, the kind that came from learning the hard way that not every offer of help came without a price, and Ethan could see it in her eyes, that hesitation, that instinct to protect herself even when she was clearly exhausted, and for a moment he almost stepped back, almost. Closed the door and let the moment dissolve into the night, but instead he stayed exactly where he was, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the open door, rain tapping against the polished surface of the car as he spoke again, softer this time, slower, like he was choosing each word carefully. "You look like you could use a ride," and she blinked, glancing past him at the empty street, then back at him, her voice barely above the sound of the rain when she answered, "I am fine," even though nothing about her looked fine at all. Not the way her shoulders were still trembling, not the way her breath came uneven, like she was trying to keep something from breaking loose, and Ethan nodded once, not pushing, not stepping closer, just letting the silence stretch between them for a second longer before he added, "It is pouring, and it is almost midnight, at least let me get you somewhere warm," and something in the way he said it, not demanding, not expectant, just simple, made her hesitate, her eyes dropping briefly to the ground before she looked back up again, searching his face like she was trying to decide what kind of man he was, what kind of choice this would be, and finally she took a small step forward, not fully committing, but not turning away either. "Just a few blocks," she said, her voice still guarded. "I do not need anything else," and Ethan gave a slight nod, stepping back to give her space as he opened the passenger door wider. "A few blocks is fine," he replied. And when she slid into the seat, carefully, like she was afraid to touch anything she did not belong to, the faint scent of rain and cold air followed her inside, mixing with the quiet warmth of the car, and for a second neither of them spoke as he closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement as he settled back behind the wheel, the engine humming softly as he pulled away from the curb. And out of the corner of his eye he noticed the way she held her hands together tightly in her lap, her fingers pale from the cold, her gaze fixed on the window like she was somewhere else entirely, somewhere far from this car, far from this night, and after a moment he reached down and turned the heat up slightly, not making a comment about it, not drawing attention, just letting the warmth fill the space between them, and she noticed, her shoulders easing just a fraction, a small change, but enough for him to see, and then, almost reluctantly, she spoke, "Thank you," the words quiet, but real, and Ethan gave a small nod, his eyes still on the road ahead. "You do not have to thank me," he said. And she let out a breath that almost sounded like a short, broken laugh. "People usually expect something," she replied, and that made him glance at her briefly, just for a second, long enough to catch the flicker of something deeper behind her words, something that had nothing to do with this night alone, and he answered simply, "Not tonight," and the car moved steadily through the empty streets, passing closed storefronts and dim streetlights, the city quieter now, softer, like it was giving them space to exist in this moment without interruption, and after another minute she gave him an address, short and direct, and he nodded again, following her directions without question, but as they turned down a narrower street, darker, less maintained, Ethan felt something shift, not in the road, but in the air between them, because when the car slowed near the corner she had indicated, she did not reach for the door handle right away, she just sat there, her reflection faint in the glass, her expression tightening slightly like she was bracing herself for something waiting outside, and for the first time since she got in, Ethan realized this was not just about getting out of the rain, this was about what she had to go back to, and quietly, without looking directly at her, he asked, "Are you sure this is where you want to be dropped off?" And the question hung there, heavier than anything he had said before, and she did not answer immediately, her fingers tightening again in her lap, her eyes fixed ahead, as if the truth was standing right outside that door, waiting for her to face it. She did not answer him right away, and that silence said more than anything she could have explained, her eyes fixed on the dim building ahead, a narrow structure with flickering lights and a broken sign hanging slightly off-center, the kind of place people ended up in when they had run out of better options, and Ethan followed her gaze, his grip on the steering wheel tightening just slightly as he took in the details, the dark windows, the worn steps, the absence of any real sense of safety, and he did not need to ask much more to understand that whatever waited for her behind that door was not something she wanted to face, at least not tonight. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, almost careful, like she was choosing what to reveal and what to keep hidden. "It is just temporary," she said, still not looking at him. "I will figure something else out," and Ethan nodded slowly, even though she could not see him, because he recognized that tone, the one people used when they were trying to convince themselves more than anyone else. And for a moment he considered letting it end here, letting her step out, letting her go back to whatever life she had been surviving before he happened to drive by, because that was what he usually did. He did not interfere, he did not involve himself in things that could spiral into something complicated, something personal, something that might stay longer than it should, but instead his hand remained steady on the wheel, his voice calm when he spoke again, "You do not have to go in there tonight." And that made her turn to him for the first time since the car had stopped, really look at him, her expression shifting from guarded to confused, maybe even a little defensive. "I do," she said quickly, almost too quickly, like she had rehearsed that answer. "I do not have anywhere else." And Ethan held her gaze for a second, not challenging her, not pushing, just letting the truth sit between them, and then he asked, "What happened?" Simple, direct, not prying but not pretending either, and she hesitated, her fingers tightening again in her lap, her eyes dropping briefly before she let out a slow breath. "I lost my job," she admitted. "The restaurant closed early tonight and they said they do not need me anymore," her voice catching slightly before she steadied. "It, and my roommate, she already found someone else to take my place, so I had to leave." She gave a small, almost humorless smile. Everything just lined up that way, and Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable but his attention fully there. And after a moment she added more quietly, "I thought I could handle it, I thought I had time," and that was when he noticed it, the small object she had been holding this entire time, partially hidden in her hand, a thin silver necklace with a tiny pendant, worn but carefully kept, her thumb brushing over it like it anchored her to something steady, something real, and without thinking he asked, "That important to you?" And she glanced down at it, her expression softening just a fraction. "It was my mom's," she said, and for the first time there was something different in her voice, not fear, not tension, but something quieter, something that carried weight, and Ethan nodded once, understanding more than she realized. Because everyone had something like that, something small that meant everything when everything else started to fall apart, and the rain continued to fall outside, steady, patient, like time itself had slowed just for this moment, and after a few seconds Ethan made a decision, not the calculated kind he was used to in boardrooms or negotiations, but something instinctive, something he could not fully explain even to himself. "There is a place a few blocks from here," he said, shifting the car slightly back into motion, "open all night, warm, safe, you can stay there for a bit, figure things out in the morning." And she looked at him again, uncertainty flickering across her face. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not accusing, just genuinely unsure, and Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes back on the road as the car moved slowly through the quiet street, the city stretching out ahead of them, and finally he said, "Because you should not have to figure everything out in the rain." And something about that answer, simple and without expectation, made her shoulders ease just a little more, her grip on the necklace loosening slightly, as if for the first time that night, she was not completely alone. The car moved again, slowly at first, then more steadily as they left the narrow street behind, the rain still falling but softer now, like the city itself was exhaling, and Lily leaned back just slightly into the seat, her shoulders no longer as tense as before, though her fingers still rested around the small silver necklace, tracing its edges as if it reminded her of who she was before everything started slipping away, and Ethan kept his eyes on the road. But he was aware of her in a way that felt unfamiliar, not like the people he usually sat beside in silence, not like the rehearsed conversations he was used to navigating. This felt real, unpolished, unpredictable, and after a minute, the glow of a 24-hour diner appeared ahead, its bright lights cutting through the grey of the night, a quiet promise of warmth and something steady, and Ethan pulled into the parking lot, the tires rolling gently over the wet pavement before the car came to a stop, and for a moment neither of them moved, the soft hum of the engine filling the space between them, and then he glanced toward her. "It is not much, but it is warm," he said simply, and Lily followed his gaze, her eyes lingering on the diner, the familiar kind of place that did not ask questions, that did not care where you came from or what you had lost, just whether you needed a seat and something hot to hold on to, and she nodded once, slowly, like she was allowing herself to accept that small comfort, and when they stepped inside, the bell above the door chimed softly, the scent of coffee and toasted bread wrapping around them instantly, a stark contrast to the cold rain outside, and Lily paused just inside the entrance, taking it in, the worn booths, the quiet hum of conversation from a couple seated near the window, the waitress behind the counter wiping down a surface with practiced ease, and Ethan noticed the way Lily's posture shifted again, a subtle change, like she was stepping back into something familiar, something she understood, and they slid into a booth near the corner, the vinyl seat creaking softly under the weight, and a waitress approached with a small, polite smile, placing 2 menus on the table. "Coffee?" she asked, and Ethan nodded, too, before Lily could answer, and she glanced at him, surprised, but did not object, and when the waitress walked away, Lily looked down at the menu, though it was clear she was not really reading it, her mind still somewhere between what had just happened and what might come next, and Ethan rested his hands lightly on the table, not too close, not too distant, giving her space without withdrawing completely, and after a moment he spoke. You said you worked at a restaurant, and she nodded, still looking down. Yeah, she said quietly, a few blocks from here, and then, almost as if she needed to say it out loud to make it real, she added, I guess I used to, and there was a small pause, the kind that carried more than the words themselves, and Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her expression, the way she held herself together even now, even after everything she had just lost in a single night. And he found himself asking something he did not usually ask anyone. What were you planning to do next? And Lily let out a soft breath, almost a laugh but without humor. That was the plan, she admitted, finally looking up at him, her eyes clearer now but still carrying the weight of the night. Keep working, save enough, maybe find a better place, something small but stable. She shook her head slightly, nothing big, just steady, and the word lingered between them, simple but powerful. And Ethan understood it more than he expected, because for all the money, all the control, all the power he had built, steady was not something he had ever truly felt, not in the way she meant it, and the waitress returned with 2 cups of coffee, setting them down gently, the steam rising between them, and Lily wrapped her hands around the cup almost immediately, the warmth seeping into her fingers, into her arms, into something deeper, and she closed her eyes for a brief second, like she was grounding herself in that simple sensation. And when she opened them again, she looked at Ethan, really looked at him, and asked quietly, so what about you? And for the first time that night, the question landed somewhere he did not expect, because no one ever asked him that without already knowing the answer, without already knowing who he was, what he had, what he represented. But here, in this small diner, in the middle of a rain-soaked night, she was asking without any of that, just asking, and Ethan paused, his hand resting near the cup of coffee he had not yet touched. And for a moment, he considered giving the usual answer, the simple one, the version that kept everything distant and controlled, but instead he said, I work, and then, after a brief pause, he added, a lot, and Lily tilted her head slightly, a faint hint of curiosity replacing some of the earlier tension. That sounds vague, she said, and there was the smallest trace of a smile in her voice, and Ethan almost smiled back, but instead he just looked at her for a second longer, realizing something he had not planned on. Something he could not ignore anymore. This was the first conversation in a long time that did not feel like a negotiation, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he did not want it to end. Lily watched him for a second longer after his answer, her fingers still wrapped around the warm cup, her eyes narrowing just slightly like she was trying to read between the lines of what he did not say, and then she gave a small nod, not pushing further, not prying, just accepting it for what it was, and somehow that made the silence that followed feel easier, less forced, as if neither of them needed to fill it with something artificial, and the soft clink of dishes and the low murmur of the diner became a kind of background rhythm, steady and grounding, and after a moment Lily spoke again, her voice softer now, less guarded than before. You do not seem like someone who just drives around picking up strangers, and there was a hint of curiosity there, but also something else, something closer to disbelief, and Ethan let out a quiet breath, glancing down at his untouched coffee before looking back at her. I am not, he said simply, and she raised an eyebrow slightly, the faintest trace of a smile touching her lips. Then why tonight? She asked, and the question lingered, not demanding an answer but not letting him avoid it either, and Ethan paused, his mind moving through a dozen familiar responses, the kind that kept things distant, controlled, predictable, but none of them felt right here, not in this place, not with her looking at him like that. So instead he said, I almost did not stop, and that was the truth, stripped down and unpolished, and Lily studied him for a second, something shifting in her expression as she absorbed that. But you did, she said quietly, and he nodded once, yeah, and for a moment that was enough, the simplicity of it settling between them in a way that felt more honest than anything else he could have said, and Lily looked down at her coffee again, tracing the rim of the cup with her finger as she spoke. Most people would not have, and Ethan did not respond right away, because he knew she was not just talking about the rain or the late hour. She was talking about everything that came before that moment, everything that had led her to be out there alone, and after a second he asked, what would you have done if I did not? And she let out a small breath, her shoulders rising slightly before she answered, kept walking. She said, that is what you do, right? You just keep going until something changes, and there was no self-pity in her voice, just a quiet acceptance that felt heavier than if she had broken down again, and Ethan leaned back slightly, watching her in a way he had not watched anyone in a long time, not assessing, not calculating, just seeing her, and it made something shift in him, something subtle but undeniable, and the waitress returned briefly to check on them, offering a refill, which Lily declined with a small shake of her head, her attention still half on the conversation, half somewhere deeper in her own thoughts, and when the waitress left again, Lily glanced toward the window, the rain still falling outside, though lighter now, more like a steady mist than the heavy downpour from earlier, and she spoke again, almost to herself. "It is strange," she said, "how everything can change in a few hours," and Ethan followed her gaze, the reflection of the diner lights stretching across the glass, and he understood that more than she realized, because his night had been just as ordinary before it suddenly was not, before he saw her, before he made the choice to stop, and after a moment he said, "Sometimes it only takes a few minutes," and she looked back at him, her expression thoughtful now, as if she was starting to see the night differently, not just as everything that went wrong, but as something else, something that had not fully revealed itself yet, and there was a quiet pause, not uncomfortable, not empty, just open, like the space between them was no longer something to be guarded but something to be explored, and then Lily did something small but significant. She set the necklace down gently on the table for the first time, her fingers no longer gripping it tightly, and she looked at him again, more directly this time. "My name is Lily," she said, and there was a steadiness in her voice that had not been there before, and Ethan met her gaze, a faint shift in his expression as he replied, "Ethan," and as the name settled between them, something unspoken but real took shape, something that neither of them had planned for, something that neither of them fully understood yet, but something that neither of them was ready to walk away from either. The name lingered between them for a moment, simple and unguarded, and for reasons Ethan could not quite explain, hearing her say it felt different from every other introduction he had experienced, because there was no expectation behind it, no recognition, no shift in tone that usually followed once people understood who he was, just Lily, sitting across from him in a quiet diner at nearly midnight, holding onto a cup of coffee like it was the first steady thing she had touched all night, and he found himself studying her again, not in the distant, analytical way he had grown used to, but in a way that felt present, grounded, and when she picked up the necklace again, letting it rest lightly between her fingers instead of gripping it tightly, he noticed that change too, small but meaningful, and after a moment she spoke, her voice calmer now, more even. "So Ethan," she said, testing the name like it was something new, "what do you actually do?" And there was curiosity there again, but softer this time, not pressing, just open, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting briefly to the window where the rain had slowed to a gentle mist, and he knew this was the point where things usually changed, where the truth complicated everything, where the balance shifted and people began to look at him differently, speak to him differently, expect something from him, and for a second he considered keeping it simple again, keeping himself in that safe distance he had maintained for years, but something about the way she was looking at him now made that feel unnecessary, so instead he answered more directly than he had before. "I run a company," he said, and Lily nodded slowly, absorbing that. "What kind of company?" she asked, and he hesitated just a fraction before replying. "Technology, infrastructure, investments," the words measured, not exaggerated, just factual. And she blinked once, her expression shifting slightly as she processed it. "That sounds big," she said, and there was no awe in her voice, just quiet acknowledgement, and Ethan gave a small shrug. "It keeps me busy," he replied, and for a second she held his gaze, searching for something more, something hidden behind the simplicity of his answer, and then she glanced down at her cup again, letting out a soft breath. "I used to think people like you had everything figured out," she said, almost absent-mindedly, and Ethan felt that sentence land somewhere deeper than it should have, because it was the kind of assumption he heard often, but never in a way that sounded this honest, and he asked quietly, "And now?" And she gave a faint, tired smile. "Now I think maybe everyone is just trying to hold things together in different ways," and that made something shift in him again, subtle but undeniable, because she was not impressed. She was not intimidated, she was not trying to get anything from him, she was just speaking, and it made the space between them feel even more real. And then, before either of them could say anything else, the bell above the diner door chimed again, the sound cutting through the quiet moment, and Lily's head turned instinctively toward the entrance, her expression tightening just slightly, not fear exactly, but alertness, like she was bracing for something she could not fully control, and Ethan noticed it immediately, the way her posture shifted, the way her hand moved instinctively back to the necklace, and he followed her gaze toward the door, where a man stepped inside, shaking the rain from his jacket, glancing around briefly before walking toward the counter, and there was nothing outwardly alarming about him, nothing that would draw attention in any other moment, but Lily's reaction was enough, the way she quickly looked back down at the table, her shoulders stiffening again, and Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in awareness, because this was the first time since they had sat down that she had looked like she might want to disappear again, and he leaned forward just slightly, lowering his voice. "Do you know him?" he asked, and she hesitated, her fingers tightening around the pendant, her voice barely above a whisper when she answered, "I think so," and the words hung there, quiet but heavy, carrying more meaning than she was willing to say out loud, and Ethan did not push further, did not ask for details, but something in him shifted again, something more protective now, more certain, and as the man at the counter glanced briefly in their direction before looking away, Ethan made a quiet decision. One that felt less like a choice and more like a line he had already crossed, because whatever this night was turning into, whatever Lily was dealing with, he was no longer just someone who had stopped his car and offered a ride. He was already involved, and for the first time in a long time, he was not trying to step back. Lily kept her eyes down, but Ethan could see the shift in her breathing, shallow and controlled, like she was trying not to draw attention, and that alone told him more than any explanation could, because people did not react like that without a reason, and he did not need to know every detail to understand that whatever connection she had to that man, it was not something she wanted to revisit, not tonight, and he leaned back slightly in his seat, positioning himself just enough to break the direct line of sight between her and the counter, not in a dramatic way, just subtle, instinctive, and after a moment he spoke quietly, his tone calm but grounded. "You do not have to stay here if you do not want to," and she shook her head quickly, still not looking up. "It is fine," she said. But the words did not match the tension in her shoulders, and Ethan let a brief silence pass before asking, "Is he the reason you were walking alone?" And that made her pause, her fingers tightening around the necklace again, and for a second it looked like she might not answer at all, but then she exhaled slowly and nodded once, barely noticeable. "Not exactly," she said softly, "but he knows people I used to work with," and that was all she offered, but it was enough. Enough for Ethan to understand that her world was smaller than it should have been, that the places she could go, the people she could avoid, they all overlapped in ways that made it harder to just disappear and start over, and he glanced toward the counter again, the man now seated with a cup of coffee, scrolling through his phone, not paying attention to them at all, at least not outwardly, and still, Lily had not relaxed, and Ethan made another decision, quieter this time, but just as firm. "Finish your coffee," he said, his voice steady. "We will head out after," and she looked up at him then, confusion flickering across her face. She repeated, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "You are not going back there tonight," he said, not as an order, not as something controlling, just as a fact he had already accepted, and she hesitated, her expression shifting again, this time not fear but something closer to uncertainty. "I cannot just keep relying on someone I just met," she said, her voice careful, like she was trying to set a boundary before it blurred too much, and Ethan nodded once, acknowledging that. "You are not relying on me," he replied, "you are just not putting yourself back in a place that does not feel right," and the distinction settled between them, subtle but important, and Lily looked down again, processing it, her fingers slowly loosening around the necklace, and after a moment she took a small sip of her coffee, the warmth grounding her again, and when she set the cup down, her hands were steadier, and Ethan watched that change, that quiet shift from panic to something closer to control, and he realized that whatever he was doing here, it was not about fixing her situation. It was about giving her space to breathe, to think, to choose. Something she clearly had not been given much of lately, and the minutes passed slowly, the diner remaining calm, unchanged, the outside world held at bay by the glass windows and steady lights, and when Lily finally finished her coffee, she looked up at him again, this time with a different kind of expression, less guarded, but still cautious. "Okay," she said quietly, and it was not agreement to everything, not trust fully given, but it was a step, and Ethan nodded once, standing as she did, both of them moving toward the door, and as they passed the counter, Lily kept her gaze forward, her posture steady, not shrinking, not rushing, just walking, and Ethan stayed just slightly beside her, not leading, not trailing, simply present, and when the door opened, the cool night air met them again, the rain now barely more than a mist, the street quieter than before, and as they stepped outside, Lily exhaled softly, a breath she had been holding longer than she realized, and for the first time since he had seen her on that street, she did not look like she was running anymore, she just looked uncertain about what came next, and Ethan understood that too, because for both of them, this night had already gone further than either of them had planned, and whatever came next, it was not going to be simple, but neither of them turned away. The night air felt different when they stepped outside, lighter somehow, even though the sky was still covered in clouds and the street still carried the quiet echo of rain, and Lily paused just for a second on the sidewalk, looking down the block as if expecting something to appear out of the shadows, something she had been trying to outrun earlier. But nothing came, just the soft glow of streetlights and the distant hum of a passing car, and she let out a slow breath, her shoulders lowering a fraction more than before, and Ethan watched her without saying anything, giving her that moment, that space to adjust, because he was beginning to understand that for her, it was not just about where she was going, it was about what she was leaving behind, and after a second she turned slightly toward him, her voice quiet but steady. "I do not know what I am supposed to do now," she admitted, and there was no panic in it this time, just honesty, the kind that came after the worst of the fear had passed, and Ethan nodded slowly, his hands in the pockets of his coat, the cool air brushing against his face as he answered, "You do not have to figure everything out tonight," and she gave a small, almost uncertain smile at that, like the idea itself felt unfamiliar, and they walked back toward the car together, their steps unhurried, the city around them calm in a way that felt almost unreal compared to how the night had started, and when they reached the Bentley, Ethan opened the passenger door again, the interior light casting a soft glow that contrasted with the dim street, and Lily hesitated for a second before getting in, not because she did not trust him, but because she was realizing that every choice now carried weight. Every step moved her further from the version of the night she had expected, and once she was seated, she looked out through the windshield, her reflection faint in the glass, her expression thoughtful, and when Ethan settled into the driver's seat, he did not start the car right away, he just sat there for a moment, considering something, and then he spoke. "There is a place I can take you," he said, his tone measured, not rushed. "It is not permanent, just somewhere safe, private, where you can rest, take a shower, think clearly," and Lily turned to him, her eyes searching his face again, not suspicious, but careful, because she understood what offers like that could mean in other situations, and she asked quietly, "Why would you do that for me?" And Ethan met her gaze, not looking away this time, not deflecting, "Because you should not have to solve everything alone," he said, and the simplicity of it hung between them, and she studied him for a second longer, as if weighing not just his words, but the consistency of everything he had done so far, the way he had not pushed, had not asked for anything, had not tried to control the situation, just stayed, and finally she nodded once, slowly. "Okay," she said, and it was not a full leap of trust, but it was enough to move forward. And Ethan started the engine, the car coming to life smoothly as they pulled away from the curb, the city unfolding ahead of them, quieter now, the streets more open as the night deepened, and Lily leaned back slightly in her seat, her grip on the necklace looser now, her fingers resting against it instead of holding on tightly, and after a few minutes of silence, she spoke again, her voice softer, reflective. "I thought tonight was going to be the worst night of my life," she said, almost to herself, and Ethan glanced at her briefly before returning his focus to the road. "And now?" he asked, and she looked out the window, the lights passing by in a steady rhythm, her expression shifting into something he had not seen before, something quieter, more grounded. "Now I think it might just be the night everything changed," she said, and the word settled into the space between them, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just real, and Ethan felt something in his chest tighten slightly at that, not in discomfort, but in recognition, because he knew, without fully understanding how yet, that she was right, that whatever had started when he chose to stop his car had already set something in motion, something neither of them could undo, and as the car moved deeper into the city, toward a place she had never seen and a future neither of them had planned, the distance between who they had been that morning and who they were becoming now grew quietly, steadily, with every mile they left behind. The city grew quieter the farther they drove, the towering buildings giving way to a more private stretch of high-rise residences, glass and steel reflecting the last traces of rain under soft white lights, and Lily shifted slightly in her seat as she took it in, her eyes moving from one building to the next, uncertainty mixing with something else now, something closer to disbelief, and when the car slowed in front of a sleek entrance with a covered drop-off, a uniformed doorman stepping forward with a polite nod, she turned to Ethan, her brows drawing together just slightly. "This is where you live?" she asked, not as a statement, but as something she was still trying to understand. And Ethan parked the car smoothly, cutting the engine before answering. "One of the places," he said, his tone calm, almost understated, but the weight of what that meant did not go unnoticed, and Lily sat there for a second longer, her hand instinctively moving to the necklace again, her thumb brushing over the small pendant as if grounding herself before stepping into something completely unfamiliar. And when Ethan stepped out and came around to open her door, she hesitated just briefly. Before accepting, her shoes touching the dry pavement beneath the canopy, the world suddenly feeling quieter, more controlled, more distant from everything she had been dealing with just an hour ago, and as they walked inside, the lobby opened around them in soft light and polished stone, the kind of place that did not echo with noise but with quiet confidence, and Lily slowed slightly, taking it in, her reflection faintly visible in the tall glass panels, her damp hair, her simple clothes, standing in contrast to everything around her, and for a second she almost stepped back, almost said she did not belong here, but Ethan did not rush her, did not guide her forward. He simply stood beside her, letting her choose, and after a moment, she continued walking, her posture steadying with each step, and they moved toward the elevators, the doors opening almost immediately as if the building itself recognized him, and once inside, the silence returned, the soft hum of the elevator, replacing the distant sounds of the city, and Lily glanced at him again, her voice quieter now, more thoughtful. "You were not going to tell me, were you?" she said, and Ethan looked ahead, not avoiding the question. "Just considering it, I did not think it mattered," he replied, and she studied him for a second longer, her expression shifting again, not impressed, not intimidated, but understanding something about him that went beyond what he had just revealed. "Maybe it does not," she said softly, and when the elevator doors opened again, they stepped into a private hallway that led directly into a spacious, warmly lit apartment, the space inviting rather than overwhelming, and Lily paused just inside the doorway, taking a slow breath, the warmth of the room settling around her, and for the first time since the night began, she did not look like she was bracing herself for what might come next. She just looked still, and Ethan set his keys down on a nearby surface, giving her space to move, to explore, to take in the reality of where she was, and after a moment she turned to him, her voice steady but honest. "This is a lot," she said, and he nodded once. "I know," and there was no attempt to minimize it. No attempt to make it seem like something it was not, and she let out a small breath, her shoulders lowering again. "I am not used to any of this," she admitted, and Ethan met her gaze, his expression softer now than it had been at any point earlier in the night. "You do not have to be," he said, and the simplicity of that settled into the space between them, and Lily looked down at the necklace one more time, her fingers resting gently against it before she let her hand fall to her side, no longer holding on as tightly. And when she looked back up at him, there was something different in her eyes now, not fear, not uncertainty, but something quieter, something stronger. "I do not know what tomorrow looks like," she said, and Ethan gave a small nod, stepping just slightly closer, not crossing any line, just enough to be present. "We will figure that out when we get there," he replied. And the words were not a promise of an easy solution, not a guarantee of anything beyond the moment they were standing in, but they were real, and as the night finally settled into something calm, something steady, Lily allowed herself to believe, just for now, that maybe she did not have to face everything alone anymore, and Ethan, standing there in a space that had always felt empty despite its size, realized that for the first time in years, it no longer felt that way.